Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Campbell, President and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and the National Convener of Black Women's Roundtable. It is my honor and pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's BWR Women of Color in Tech Policy series, where our topic for today is centering online privacy as a civil right. The need for federal data privacy law protections. For communities of color, the right to data privacy is a matter of survival. Using personal data in ways that violates privacy puts communities of color at risk of discrimination in ways that impact our economic stability, housing, voting rights, health, and many other rights and freedoms, and so much more. For communities of color, there is an urgent need for the federal government to step in and move forward with data privacy laws that ensure privacy protections and adherence to civil rights. The FTC has been doing a study and it's taking a while. I think it's really important that report comes out soon so we can kind of see what's really going on the issue of privacy. During today's discussion, our panelists will provide us with insight on how our personal data is being used in ways that violate civil rights. We'll also learn how these violations impact women and communities of color and what federal protections are necessary to safeguard our personal data and civil rights when we're online. I want to take this moment to thank our sponsors for today's Women of Color Policy Series event, AARP and Comcast NBC Universal. We are grateful for their continued partnership and support of our work on the issue of data privacy as a civil right, an issue that is crucial to every aspect of the lives of Black women, our families, and communities. Now, before we hear, and before I bring on remarks from our Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, I want to first thank Jocelyn Tate, our Senior Policy Advisor for Technology, for the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and Black Women's Roundtable, for her steadfast work, her steadfast leadership in being the glue for us, in being on top of these issues around technology and its impact on our communities. So now I'd like for us to hear from from Congresswoman Yvette Clarke from the great state of New York to share important remarks with us about the topic of today's discussion. Congresswoman Clarke is a leader in Congress on tech policy. As a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Congresswoman Clarke works diligently to ensure that communities of color are not marginalized or disadvantaged by technology and big data. Congresswoman Clarke, welcome and thank you for taking the time to share remarks with us today.
Greetings, everyone. I am Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke, and I proudly represent New York's 9th Congressional District, that's Central and South Brooklyn. Before I begin, let me say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be a part of the Women of Color in Tech Policy series, as well as thank the Black Women's Roundtable for hosting this critical event. Women's Roundtable's commitment to championing public policies that center civil rights and racial and gender equity in technology is of immense value to our community. We can't thank them enough for their hard work and their diligence, their commitment. In the absence of a national U.S. data privacy law, our personal data is currently collected and sold under a patchwork of regulations that do little to protect consumers. Interested parties can collect and monetize online data at an unprecedented scale with little scrutiny or regulation. Privacy violations of historically marginalized groups long predate the digital age. However, we know that in the age of big data, vulnerable populations, including communities of color, face unique privacy risks. Personal data can be used in ways that perpetuate or exacerbate systemic biases, racial and gender discrimination. Predictive analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence only amplify the power to use personal information in potentially harmful ways. Such violations enable discriminatory advertising, racially biased policing, and the surveillance of historically marginalized groups. So, to address this, I reintroduce the Algorithmic Accountability Act this Congress, along with Senators Ron Wyden and Cory Booker, the first ever bill that directly addressed the growing challenge of bias and discrimination in algorithmic driven decision making. Without a doubt, issues of algorithmic bias and data privacy are inextricably linked. And that is why I am thrilled that key pieces of that legislation have been included in the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, a bipartisan and bicameral effort to protect data privacy and civil rights online. The legislation calls for data minimization while providing individuals with the means to delete data associated with them and to opt out of targeted advertising and third party data transfers. Data privacy involves balancing an individual's right to know how their data is being used and the right to have some control over that data. At the end of the day, your right to privacy and access to privacy rights should not be a privilege or a price to be paid for commercial profits. That right to privacy is about the protection of consumers, their dignity, and their survival. Our nation desperately needs comprehensive federal privacy protections. And as a Black woman in Congress, I vow to continue spearheading this critical work on Capitol Hill. So let me thank you all for being here today and for listening. And many thanks to the Black Women's Roundtable for all the work that you do on this most timely and most crucial issue. I look forward to an informative discussion. Stay well, be well, stay safe, and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. Thank you for your leadership and being unwavering and fighting for what's good and great for all of us in these United States. I want to turn over our program now to our moderator of the hour, Jocelyn Tate, our Senior Technology Policy Advisor for the Black Women's Roundtable. But before I do that, too, also, hey, Jocelyn, hey there.
Hi. Hello.
I want to thank Roland Martin Unfiltered, who is our steadfast media partner, who helps us to provide and get this out to our communities. And I want to thank our back end tech team under the leadership of Antoinette Miner and our other team members at the National Coalition. You know who you are. So, Jocelyn, I turn the program over to you, my sister.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And I want to thank our panelists today for joining us. And let me just introduce them really quickly. First of all, we have Jessica Gonzalez. She's the co-CEO of Free Press. Elisa Valentine. She is the director. She directs technology policy at the Urban League. And we also have Sina Anashri. She is at the. She directs She works with the technology issues at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. Ladies, thank you all so much for joining us today on this very important topic that should be at the top of mind for anyone who is online. So let's just jump into this discussion right now. And first, I want to direct a question to you, Sina. What are some of the ways that our personal data is currently being collected and used by tech companies or third-party data brokers and service providers in ways that we may not even realize?
Sure. Thank you so much. I wanted to thank the Black Women's Roundtable for having us all here today to discuss this incredibly important subject. This can be a very involved and long answer, but our activity on the internet is valuable. In fact, everything we do, including everywhere we click, all the pages we browse, and anything we buy is valuable to some company somewhere. So for example, our internet activity, information available about us online, online purchases, GPS location, they are all collected, processed, and sold daily by a variety of companies, websites, and analysis firms. The current state of the internet makes it practically unavoidable for our personal data not to be tracked and collected. However, this most often happens without our knowledge and is used in discriminatory and harmful ways because we lack strong federal privacy protections. So before the internet, advertisers and marketers would target the audience they wanted to reach by showing ads on TV at certain times of the day or publishing their ads in newspapers that their audiences read. But everyone who looked in that place could find that deal, including for houses or jobs. Now advertisers are able to collect information about who you are, specifically to target you or exclude you based on who you are. We've never had this ability to target out on the basis of identity and behavior in such a micro-targeted way before. And this can be used in extremely harmful ways, including in housing, employment, education, healthcare, social media harms, expanded criminalization, and consumer services. And I can go into some examples just to give some color to what these harms look like in our everyday life. But some of the most important ones I would say is and the most relatable, I think, is like social media harms, right? So disinformation on the platforms is often targeted at communities of color and especially non-English speaking communities. When there aren't restrictions on how our personal data is collected and used, it's easily accessible to bad actors who have targeted election and COVID misinformation to our communities. Something that I think is probably maybe on the tip of everybody's tongue at this moment is access to reproductive health care. When we have expanded criminalization, what we're seeing is that data brokers, they can sell our geolocation information about people who visit abortion clinics, as well as information from period tracking apps. And we've seen prosecutors who previously used online search data against people accused of accessing abortions. And this, the lack of strong digital privacy protections has profound implications in the face of expanded criminalization of reproductive health care. And I mean, there's more in housing, employment. Amazon recently used a hiring algorithm for years that automatically penalized resumes for including the word women's and gave lower priority to applicants who graduated from women's colleges. There's also targeting of for-profit predatory at higher institutions at Black and Latino students. These were for-profit universities that would trap higher levels of debt and loan defaults than students at public nonprofit schools, and they were micro-targeting these communities online. These are just a few. There are so many more examples I can give, and I'm more than happy to talk more about any specific issue that folks here want to speak to today.
Thank you so much for that great overview, because and just speaking about the apps that have been used to target people seeking reproductive services. There is a company that sold the location data of 600 people who visited Planned Parenthood just recently. So that is very important, and sold that information without any of these people's knowledge. So this is very important, particularly in light of the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson. So thank you so much for that. Jessica, let me turn to you for a second. What are some of the key issues that your organization is concerned about when it comes to data protection, data privacy, and civil rights?
Thanks so much, Joycelyn. Thanks to the Black Women's Roundtable for having me, and to Melanie Campbell, and thanks to Yvette Clarke, the Congresswoman, for championing this issue. I'd like to talk a bit about what I think we deserve as everyone online, but in particular as women of color, and compare that to what we actually have. It's important to understand that when we go on Facebook or WhatsApp or Twitter or YouTube on down the line, we are the product. We are being sold to advertisers. And the amount of time that we spend on that website, everything is being tracked. What we click on, what we like, what we comment on. They know our age, our ethnicity, whether or not we're parents, whether we have a health condition, whether our kids have health conditions. They know our location. They know our credit history, whether we own a home. I mean, it just goes on and on, right? What I think we deserve is to be able to go online, to connect, to build community, to get access to healthcare, to get access to education, job opportunities, and on, without having everything we do be tracked and monetized in a way that has no benefit to us. This is a completely extractive business model that sells our personal data that can then be used in discriminatory ways and has been used in discriminatory ways against us. What we deserve is to be able to traverse the internet without this exploitative tracking. That choice should be in our hands. We should not be helping Mark Zuckerberg get rich or even richer by turning over our personal data without our consent. You know, this has been used, for example, in 2020. Our personal data has been used to target the Latino community to persuade them to not participate in the US Census. Think about that. The US Census, that's how we draw boundary lines. That's how we figure out representation, the most fundamental tenet of our democracy. And there are active efforts underway to target Black and Brown voters to get us not to vote, to get us not to be counted, to excuse us from democracy. And it would be a whole heck of a lot harder if there were some basic ground rules in place. And I'll just say one more thing before I turn it back to you, Joycelyn. There are some state bills in place to protect privacy. Those bills are not good enough. As a Californian, I'm glad we have a California privacy bill. It does some things. It does not prohibit the use of our data in discriminatory ways. As a Californian, I'm ashamed that we are exporting discrimination, exploitation, civil rights abuses, and harassment unchecked. We need a federal remedy. We need a global remedy. We deserve better than this. And this affects everyone. If you don't want your kids' health info tracked, if you don't want everyone to know everything you do online, doesn't matter if you're white, Black, rich, poor, this affects you. But it has a disproportionate effect on women and people of color because of the ways this data is being used to further discriminate against us.
Excellently said, excellently stated. Alisa, let me ask you, could you share with us some specific ways that our data is being used, particularly and our civil rights are being violated, particularly in communities of color and women and Black women in particular?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much to Black Women's Roundtable for having me. Thank you to Melanie Campbell, Congresswoman Clark for providing your remarks. Also, thank you to Joycelyn for bringing us all together today. It is no easy feat to put an event together, whether it's virtual or in person. So thank you so much for your leadership. But let me first begin by saying that privacy rights are civil rights. I can't stress that enough. And as you've already alluded to in your question, Joycelyn, and as the other panelists also stated, discriminatory uses of data online, there are real offline harms, and it can exclude communities from a wide range of opportunities, as was said earlier. So we're talking about housing advertising, like as Sinai said, you have the ability to target ads to renters and buyers based on someone's race or their religion or their sex. As it relates to lending algorithms, you can calculate higher interest rates for borrowers who attend historically Black colleges and universities. healthcare algorithms have suggested that healthier white patients should receive more services to manage their health than sicker Black patients. And it's the data that's being collected and processed that's really fueling these algorithms. We're giving over our sensitive information, as you stated earlier, Joycelyn, sometimes unknowingly, right? That health information, that location information, to not just get the service that we're seeking out, but we're also giving it to a world of data brokers we wouldn't be able to map out unless we were the platform ourselves. And on the point, I just want to pick up about election disinformation specifically. The National Urban League, we have a State of Black America report that comes out every year, and we've over the last several years, there's been a lot of our contributors who have been talking about the issue of disinformation. And it's because it remains one of the biggest threats to our democracy. So from our vantage point, and I know from your vantage point as well, Joycelyn, your organization, we've seen the way that Black voters have been dissuaded from participating in elections, particularly in 2016 and also in 2020, by both foreign and domestic actors, right? So this legislation is really important because it really will give us an opportunity to limit data access of bad actors who want to target election and disinformation at communities of color and also non-English speaking communities, as the other panelists stated earlier. And I know that I kind of spoke about sensitive data, but we also have to be mindful of how our non-sensitive data is used as well. So the things that we follow, the things that we like, and how those kind of profiles are created about us and how to target us. And I want to be really clear too, that this is happening because people know how incredibly important our votes are. And they know that we can change the trajectory of this country in a more positive and a more inclusive direction. We're being targeted because people know that we have power, right? People have to pull from the playbooks of yesteryear and bring them into present day to maintain or grab at our political and social power. And that is why we need to combat these practices by ensuring our civil rights are protected in the digital age.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That is so important, especially during this election, that we see all of this disinformation going out online with these heated midterm elections in several states. It's very important that our right to our civil rights and our right to voter protections are covered with in some type of federal legislation. Let me ask a question of all of you. Recently, the Energy and Commerce Committee passed the American Data Privacy and Protection Act through the committee. It's now out of committee. And what would the provisions of the act create? How would it create privacy and civil rights framework to protect our personal data? What are some of those provisions? And that's open to anyone. And I'll start with you first, Alicia.
Yes. So there are strong civil rights protections that prohibit using personal data in a manner that discriminates, with goods or services on the basis of protected characteristics. Also, there are important data minimization provisions that limit data collection, limit data use and sharing, and also it imposes heightened restrictions on the sensitive data that we've all discussed earlier, like browsing history, location data, health information, or biometric data. And there's also requirements to test algorithms for bias and measure potential impacts on equal access to eligibility for housing, employment, credit, education, et cetera. But I do want to also pick up on something that I don't think is discussed enough, because obviously a lot of times we're focused on the consumers, but I think it's also important, and we do this at National Urban League, to focus on also the creators, right, and the entrepreneurs, and the amount of economic opportunities that are created because of digital age that we couldn't have imagined years ago. Some of our friends at Take Creative Control actually just published the Creator Economy report. I believe this was last month that they published this, where they highlight that 11.1 million creators earned $23.6 billion online in 2020. That's a massive amount of money, right? That can create generational wealth for people of color and lead to not only changes in one's household, but also in one's community. But there are disparities online in what creators of color make as compared to white creators. There are also disparities online as it relates to how much women creators make online as compared to their male counterparts. So we have to ask ourselves, what's preventing these online spaces from being equitable? And that's why we need transparency into what algorithmic decisions are being made, because I think we've all heard the anecdotes about certain communities' content being prioritized over, certain creators where things actually really started, right? This is, at the end of the day, about a platform being able to kind of pick and choose who the winners and losers are. And that inevitably is determining who makes money. So I just wanted to bring up that point as well.
Joycelyn, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Technology is great when it works, and then sometimes we mess it up. But Sine, what are some of the key provisions in this act that you feel are most important to help us protect our civil rights and our data privacy?
Thanks, Joycelyn. I think Elisa brought up some really amazing points. But I mean, just off the top of my head, the ones that are probably most important, ADPPA is more protective of sensitive data because rather than requiring users to take action to limit the use of their location or health data via an opt-out link, ADPPA limits the use of sensitive data by default, unless strictly necessary to provide a service for one of the specified actions. There's also a distinction between ADPPA and the California privacy law, which is that, and I think Jessica already mentioned this part, but that ADPPA crucially prohibits discriminatory use of data, and California law doesn't. So companies and service providers may not collect, process, or transfer covered data in a manner that discriminates on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, or disability under the ADPPA. And then I think maybe one more I would mention is that ADPPA requires the FTC to establish a do not collect mechanism where individuals may submit a single request to all registered data brokers to have their covered data deleted within 30 days. I think you would have to maybe, it's been likened to the do not call registry where you sign up for this, but it's a great sort of tool to give consumers a little bit more control over their own data, which is something that it should be the floor. That why don't we have control over our data, right? Just as Jessica said, like we are the product that is being sold to these companies. Why, if their business model is based off of us and our data, I mean, there's even been proposals. Why aren't we seeing a chunk of that change, right? But maybe the floor needs to be that we have some sort of say over what data gets collected and how long it is retained. And this do not collect mechanism gives us the option to request that at least that data be deleted.
Jessica, now you mentioned earlier you are in California, and California does have some of the strongest data protection laws in the country, along with some other states, Colorado and Connecticut. And you mentioned earlier you're concerned that even California's law doesn't provide some of the protections that are really needed in order to really protect our data, our personal data, and our civil rights. Now, there has been some concerns raised about and the ADPPA, which is short for this act, and that it would preempt states' privacy laws. What would you say to that, and how would you respond to that, being as a Californian?
Well, lifelong Californian, we like to fancy ourselves as trendsetters here. And I think California passed a really solid law that we ought to be proud of, but it simply isn't good enough. And the ADPPA is a much stronger piece of legislation for reasons that Sana and Elisa have already laid out. And namely, there is no prohibition on using our data in discriminatory ways in the California bill. So if your main objective is to protect privacy and civil rights online, you understand that the California bill simply isn't good enough. As a general matter, I like bills that set a floor for protection, not a ceiling. As has been mentioned, this is a bicameral and a bipartisan bill. This is a really strong bill. And I hope what the legislators can do is to figure out ways that preemption is only in operation when there is a conflict between state and federal law. There's a lot in ADPPA that is not in the California bill, a lot of protections, just baseline protections that would not exist in the California bill alone. Of course, California bill only protects Californians. I think we have a responsibility to the world. Our economy here benefits greatly from the tech platforms, as many of them are based and were founded here in the state. We have an opportunity to make amends for our export of hate and extremism and discrimination that's happening on these platforms. We can't just protect ourselves. We have to think about this as a community. And even if we weren't, I want, as a Californian, these protections that are in the federal bill. So there are ways to work this out. There are agreements that can be made, but at this time, the bill does not force California to not enforce provisions that don't relate to the language that's in the federal bill. So there's always room for debate and improvement of these things. But I will say I have never seen a 42 to 3 or 52 to 3 vote out of the committee. Is tremendous bipartisan support in a recognition that people all over the country, conservative, Democrat, all colors of the rainbow, understand that we want some baseline privacy and civil rights protections. And I think we really deserve that. So I hope that Congress can figure that out. But at this time, if I had to pick between the two, I would absolutely pick the federal bill. It just provides much more robust protections.
And just to add a little bit more context to that, this bill that's in the House right now expressly even preserves some state protections. Expressly, it preserves probably about 16 state laws, including consumer provisions and others. So, contrary to what some people have been saying, that this bill will preclude all state actions, state provision, state laws. If you really look through the bill, and I've read through the bill, it really doesn't. So let me ask another question, and Alisa, let me put this question to you. And we were talking about some of the ways that our data is being used. I want to go back to that so people can really understand how our data is being used in ways that we don't even realize. And let me go to policing, for example. So, Alisa, or could you just elaborate on how our data is being used in policing?
Yeah, I think some of kind of like building on the point of like relates like reproductive justice is something I'd like to kind of pick up on. You know, our geolocation data is some of the most sensitive data that we have. And just like, you know, our technology is being used to prove other, you know, crimes, the same could be said as it relates to proving that someone had an abortion, right? And on the point that also was just mentioned by Jessica about, you know, California, I'm probably just going to really echo everything that Jessica just said. But, you know, we acknowledge that California is a leader as passing the strongest, you know, kind of privacy laws in the country. But as what happens in many cases when California acts, the rest of the country follows. And that's why we're here today, even having this conversation about federal legislation. And as Jessica already mentioned, there are protections in the federal bill that just don't exist in the California law. And for us that are on this call today, it is about those explicit and direct civil rights protections. And also the data minimization provisions in the federal bill are more robust as well. And also, just want to pick up on something else that Jessica said. There's a coordinated attack on people of color across the country that don't have the backing of progressive or progressive adjacent leaders. So we have to make sure that we're leading with a spirit of altruism and fact-based and principled policies. And the fact is, I'm not here for allowing tech companies to just kind of like self-regulate, do their own thing, make promises that are not enforceable. And so that just can't just be the case in California. It has to be the case across the country. And going back to issues related to reproductive justice, we know that they're the places where Black birthing persons are a lot of times in the rural South, right? And these are the communities that are under attack. And we know that, the folks that are in the governor's mansions and the state legislatures are not going to protect those communities. We've seen that. They're not concerned about us. So we have to make sure that there are protections across the nation.
Thank you so much. And let me say this. I know we've been using a lot of some terms and terminology that is actually in the bill. Let me parse out the term data minimization. What does that mean for the average consumer? And anyone can answer that.
So this is the concept. Say you go on Uber and you want a car ride, right? Well, Uber needs to know where you are right then when you ask for the car and where you're going. After that, it doesn't need any more data about it. This is about companies collect. This is like a non-technical answer, right? But I think that's what you're asking for. It's about companies collecting just the amount of data that they need to give the service that you're asking for. If I may,
Sure.
also just talk a bit about further differentiating the California and the federal privacy bill. There's actually a great comparison piece that I want to plug that was done by EPIC and I believe the Lawyers Committee and the Center for Democracy and Technology. But it's on epic.org's website and it goes through provision by provision and compares what is in the federal bill versus what is in the California law. And there's a lot of things in here where they're roughly equivalent, maybe a few provisions. They're stronger on the California side, but data minimization much stronger at the federal level, protection of sensitive data much stronger at the federal level, use and disclosure, transparency coming in at about the same, stronger on the federal level. But the civil rights protections, of course, stronger. The prohibits our use of discriminatory data stronger at the federal level, but also all state civil rights laws are exempt from preemption. So it's not going to come in and preempt state civil rights laws. And then the impact, the study, the algorithmic impact assessments, what is this doing? Companies will always claim they don't have malintent, but this federal bill will require an actual assessment of whether there were discriminatory or privacy invasive impacts. So there's just a lot more protections for kids and teens in the federal bill. I really recommend for people who really want to get into the weeds of this to go to the Electronic Privacy Information Center website at epic.org. It's a really great analysis of where one bill is versus the law.
Exactly. And let me ask this. Well, let me say this so that people can really understand, because I think you all have really laid out how our data is being used and why we need these federal protections. And I just want to lay it out a little bit more. When we talk about, Elisa, you were talking about reproductive rights and how our data can be used now in policing where we are to be, and that data can be used, could be used to prosecute people for maybe seeking in reproductive services. So let me also add for our audience, just simple things, privacy and policing, just simple things like Amazon's Ring app. They have now partnered with law enforcement so that the video footage that you get from your Ring app outside your house or at your front door, now the police can get that information without a warrant. So that goes back to what you were saying, Jessica, when you were giving your example of data minimization. This information shouldn't be used for that purpose. It only should be used for the purpose of what it was intended. And of course, the privacy violations. And who knows how many people knew that their information on a Ring app that they just use for the protection of their home is now being can now be surveilled by the police to watch your personal coming and goings from your home, and your friends' personal comings and goings from your home, or even if you have the app around your house, who's moving around your house. So these are the types of things that we really need federal protections for. State laws are great, but they only protect in a particular state. So let me go on and ask about other provisions in this legislation right now. They have provisions to protect children. Why is that so important? Targeted advertising against children. Why is that so important? And anyone can jump in on that.
I'll say something. Because even in California, so it's election time, my kids are on YouTube. Oh my goodness, with my kids coming in telling me what propositions to vote for or not. They're like little sponges, right? And they believe everything they see, right? Because they haven't learned to consider the source and context clues and all that. But it's much deeper than whether or not I should vote yes on Prop 27. Okay. The kids say no, by the way. They've been fed a lot of ads. My kids are being targeted. They're boys. Okay. They're already, because they're interested in Minecraft. This is a game that they play, very innocuous game where they build community, basically. They get targeted with these videos of people who show them how to play Minecraft, and some are fine, and some are filled with misogyny, they're like being groomed to be little misogynist racists through these videos. And I'm not going to say how old my kids are to respect their privacy, but let's just say they are young and they are impressionable. And so it's not just that they're getting targeted with political ads or with ads that make them want to buy a certain toy. They are getting targeted with content that is getting ingrained in their belief system. And so I have to run interference on that because I'll overhear something and I'll be like, whoa, Preston's out. You can't watch Preston's videos anymore. Oh, but YouTube just sent them my way.
So important.
It's scary. And I do not have time to micromanage my kids' social media lives, but I do.
That's so important. And that's one of the protections that is in the bill that we do need in federal privacy legislation to protect our children just from those very things that you were talking about. Sina, there's also a portion of the bill called private right of action. Can you explain that to our viewers and why that's important?
Sure. So this particular bill allows for a private right of action and FTC enforcement, which I think is going to be more important for working out a lot of the kinks in how broadly the statute is construed, which is a good thing. We want a broad statute so that, and having that with a private right of action allows for a lot of the details to be worked out by individual consumers who are harmed. A private right of action is something that I think we're kind of really lucky to have in this bill, and that it's gotten so far. 53-2 it passed the committee. So this is something that it's a tool of power that is available to consumers, and it means that individuals are able to fight for their rights. They don't have to wait for the government or, in some cases, the DOJ, right, to step in for them. So that's something that it's a community empowerment, potentially a tool. And it also makes companies very wary of litigation, potential litigation. If they can be sued through this private right of action, they will be more cautious in how they use our data through the ADPPA. So it's it's a potentially really powerful tool. But there are so many things that Jessica mentioned about the targeting of children, and it's so terrifying, especially because YouTube's algorithm and how they target kids with the recommendations of videos. One, there's so much scholarship now on this sort of pipeline of gaming into misogyny and racism. It's literally they've charted it that how one video sort of leads to the next through these algorithms. But what's scary is that these algorithms, they are so black box that without that transparency of knowing how these recommendations are being made and to who, the provision that protects targeting, protects children under the age of 17 from being targeted through this advertising is kind of the tool that we have as a defense in this sort of really terrifying setup that we're currently seeing. But that was to Jessica's point, but I wanted to echo that.
It's just
Great.
sad because they're doing something so innocent, which is playing. And because of the pandemic, I never thought my kids would be online as much as they are now.
Oh,
Because
I'm like terrified to have my son online. Like I'm like, no YouTube. Like YouTube is dangerous.
I
That's
know,
like,
but like that's the way that so they get on Minecraft to connect and have community. And like we had to do it during the pandemic because they were so lonely. And now
yeah, it
I
was.
never thought we'd be so online with our kids, but now I feel like we had no other choice. And it's increased the responsibility as a parent to like watch everything because the way they start off with this gentle misogyny and then it escalates, right?
It's terrifying.
There's an escalation and it's very intentional.
It's so terrifying, and it's on every app. Like YouTube is one. And I mean, my son is watching YouTube. Like he loves tornado videos, and I'm like sitting there like bracing myself. Like what's the algorithm gonna suggest next? How can tornadoes be sinister? Let me think about that. Like it's so yeah.
And that's just a good example of how the algorithms work, because I don't think people really understand how they're being targeted. With the algorithms, once you watch one thing, then the algorithms determine, okay, you like this, we'll give you more of that, and we'll give you more of that. And that's how people end up with a tunnel view or a tunnel vision of a particular issue. So if any one of you could jump in and just talk about how that, those algorithms are being used in a way, not in a way that discriminates, yes, but also in a way that fuels a lot of other types of activity and polarizing activity that we've seen.
I mean, I think we can just reference January 6th, right? Like people kind of existing in these silos and going kind of further and further down like these tunnels of hate and election disinformation and all of that. And then that content also like constantly being kind of amplified on their various pages. And I do think, interestingly enough, and I'm bringing this up because I'm a adjunct professor at Norfolk State University. I teach a media law and policy course there. And I was with my students a few weeks ago, and we were kind of talking about these issues of AI and privacy. And they kept bringing up the fact that there's also like a consumer education piece to this as well, right? And I think we're starting to see that kind of like, percolate a little bit, with privacy and with algorithms. People are always saying things like, oh, they're blaming the algorithm and all that. So I do think there's a consumer education piece as well, so that we can like kind of actively fight against these things. But it's not just on the consumers, right? Mm-hmm. This is going to take a whole of nation approach. It's going to take the corporations. It's going to take, us as consumers. It's definitely going to take our federal government as well.
Exactly. And our federal government is a very important piece of that. Thus, why we have this proposed legislation now. Anybody want to jump in on some of the other provisions that are in the bill? I know that we have some provisions in there about a duty of loyalty where, there would be it'd be prohibited, entities would be prohibited from collecting or using or transferring data that is not reasonably necessary or that's only proportionate to what you need. And I think we talked to that a little earlier when we talked about the data minimization. So anybody else want to speak to the data minimization or the duty of loyalty that's in the bill? I think you're muted.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to jump on the data minimization part because, as we're talking about so many of the harms that we're facing online, we don't quite understand because of, for one example, the black box nature of the algorithms and that they're not transparent. But the interesting thing is that so many of the harms that we currently face. I was speaking to my colleague Alex Alt. He's our policy counsel, and he had a really gorgeous analysis for this, or analogy, I should say. And it's that it's an ecosystem, right? But the data that we have is the what the ecosystem feeds off of. So if we dry up the feed, we can dry up some of these harms in this ecosystem. And that's why the data minimization component of this bill is so important. Because all the harms we're talking about, whether it comes to social media harms and how algorithms are amplifying hate, targeting, misinformation, voter suppression at people of color and marginalized communities, the way to address that is through potentially data and protecting it. And that's why the minimization is so important.
Thanks so much. There are provisions in the bill also about how do you think this bill would impact small or medium-sized businesses? Because we're talking about the large tech companies and they have all the tools and things that they need to adhere to this. But what about those small or medium-sized businesses? How would this impact their ability to operate in the tech ecosystem? And anybody can jump in on that, because I think there's a provision of the bill that does provide a threshold for small or medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, I'm trying to track down the language, but I'll just stop doing that. So
well, I'll just mention that
there's going to be some room to grow before companies are subject to these provisions. Yeah, so that startups will not have the same burdens of the large companies.
Yeah, there is an exception for small businesses to be exempt from some of the applications of the rules, so that they're not crushed. But it's also really important because getting at the big players is really important to help small businesses thrive too, right? And there's been a lot of scholarship also on how data concentration it also kills the market, the free market for players to come in. So when you've got a handful of these massive companies that suck up all the data, they have such market dominance that they essentially kill the competition. So I think the exact statute is that the small businesses are exempt from the private right of action and the algorithmic assessments.
Thank you so much for that, because that's really one thing that will, could be a barrier for small businesses getting into the tech space. So it's good to know that there are provisions in this bill, and the Congress is looking at provisions to address small businesses and their ability to get into the tech space. Right now, we'd like to.
Joycelyn,
go ahead.
Yeah, is that there will be a rulemaking that happens at the Federal Trade Commission to sort of lay further ground rules about how this will be enforced at the federal level. And we actually should have a conversation in that context about small business and where the lines should be drawn.
Exactly. And actually, I will put some information put some information out. We're going to put some information out at the Black Women's Roundtable about that that period that's going to be opening up so that people can comment about how this will impact small businesses. So let's open it up now to some questions. If we have any questions from our audience here, I'll open it up and I'll defer to my tech team here. They say that there's no questions so far. Okay. So
Can
if we
I
could
jump in, Joycelyn, real quick?
Sure.
Just because Jessica brought up the FTC, so I think that's kind of a good transition point. As it relates to the FTC, and I know that they would probably be smiling to hear us say this, but they need more resources, right? Like they need more folks working there. They also need an Office of Civil Rights, right? Like one that has real teeth, real power, similar to the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, but that means that it has to be well resourced. And but we need like strong enforcement, but we also need we need the technologists working at the FTC as well. And it's really difficult. Like, how can you compete with the amount of money that like tech companies are handing over to new grads and that sort of a thing? And that's something a government really need to kind of figure out, because we're definitely having trouble keeping up with all these technological advancements, whether it be on the agency level or whether it be on the Hill. And again, I think that pay equity is definitely an issue there, but we need to really get it figured out because we need more expertise. We need more resources at the FTC and also on the Hill.
And speaking of the FTC, while we're talking about that, there is a provision in this current legislation that we're discussing that does give enforcement. There is a provision in there for enforcement that does give enforcement to the Federal Trade Commission, as well as state attorney generals and state privacy authorities. So there is a whole mechanism to provide enforcement of these data protection rules that's in this proposed bill, which is something that we need on the federal level. It gives enforcement authority on several different levels, from the federal level on down. So that's something that's very important.
Yeah, and we need it. We need detailed people here. Like Congress needs to pass a bill, absolutely, and then we need people to execute that. And we have subject matter experts at the Federal Trade Commission who are well equipped to do this. So I am in fullest support, like Elisa, of more authority, both in terms of rulemaking, but also in terms of enforcement authority, but also funds to that agency so that it can do its job and stand up to these tech billionaire folks.
Okay, just turning back over to our team here. Do we have any questions so far? Okay, no questions. Ladies, let me just open it up for a round robin here really quickly. I'll start with you, Jessica. Give us, and if you had to give the elevator pitch for civil rights protections, what and civil rights and data privacy protections, what would it be?
Listen, I got into this work because my community was under attack. Okay. We followed that from talk radio to cable TV, and now we're here. And we're being attacked in a really unique way now. Not like anything we've ever seen. We've always been attacked, right? Communities of color in the United States. But this targeted attack based on our demographic data is somewhat new. So we're getting it both ways. We're getting attacked by white supremacists who are being recruited and radicalized online and pushed towards content that platforms believe they might be interested based on their perceived vulnerabilities and demographic data, that is radicalizing a whole new generation of white supremacist extremists who are willing to commit violence against us. But we're also being attacked by a steady flow of false information that's being targeted to us based on our ethnicity, our country of origin, our language, our immigration status, and our age, our medical condition. I mean, just they have little dossiers on all of us that are being used to discriminate against us. We deserve better than this. The federal bill is such a great place for us to start to bring actual accountability to these platforms to bring us privacy, to bring us civil rights, to protect our democracy, and to stop the flow of hate and extremism online. We have so much work to do. This is really baseline to start that work.
Okay. Senna.
Thanks, Jessica. I think Jessica's just said it phenomenally. But real data privacy ensures that people's identities and backgrounds cannot be used against them unfairly. Because of that, privacy rights are civil rights, and privacy sits at the heart of our democracy. So many of the harms we face online, like we've discussed throughout the panel today, they're connected to each other. And the thing that they have in common is this wellspring of our data that is out there. And if you've got an ecosystem where you can find out anything about anyone, those harms are magnified. This bill in particular is important because if there's less data in the universe, then they can't isolate and target people, especially people from marginalized communities, communities of color, as easily as they have to. And I think the one harm that is probably at the forefront of everybody's mind, whether they're into tech or not, is the amplification of hate, violence, radicalization that occurs on social media, right? That's something that I think, you don't need to really understand tech. And I think a lot of people's eyes do glaze over when we talk about tech. That's something that resonates with everyone. And so much of that takes place online through the social media platforms. And it's because they have these algorithms that process and spit out our data in different ways. But what would it look like if we had more control and protections around that data to begin with?
Elisa.
Yeah, I think my co-panelists laid it out perfectly, but just to kind of echo the points that they brought up, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act is civil rights legislation. That's the way that we're viewing it. And, it's not a silver bullet to fix everything that's wrong with our online platforms. And while it's not perfect, and I don't think anyone in the civil rights community or racial justice community would claim that it is, there are very strong protections that are in this legislation that have been fought for a long time by the civil rights community. And I would say it's meaningful compromise. And so we need to kind of continue with the momentum that we have now to protect people's data. And I would just quickly add, in a perfect world, if I was Queen Valentine, right, and I could wave my magic policy wand, we'd have a federal floor and allow states to build privacy kind of laws on top of that. But again, this is a kind of, I don't want to say it's a once in a generation, because listen, the generations behind us, they're gonna be okay. They're gonna have it figured out. But in our moment in time, it is up to us to make sure that we pass this legislation. The time is now. The time was really yesterday. The time was years ago. But we need to make sure that we do this now.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, ladies, I think this is great. What you're saying is we at least need a federal floor. It won't be the end all, but we need the federal floor to start so that everyone's protected. State laws are great, but we need that federal floor. With it, that is really the floor, not the ceiling, and it's not the end. Ladies, we've had a great discussion here today. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Jessica Gonzalez from Free Press, Elisa Valentine from the National Urban League, Sana Aneset, help me here.
It's Sana. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much. We want to thank you ladies all so much for sharing information with us today. I hope that I'm absolutely sure that our viewers today got a lot of information, learned a lot about how their information their data and privacy information is being used online in ways that a lot of people don't even realize, and the things that we need in place to protect our data and our civil rights. Ladies, I want to thank you all for being with us today. I want to thank our leader, Melanie Campbell, the president and CEO of the Black Women's Roundtable, and the president and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. And she is the national convener of the Black Women's Roundtable for thinking this topic is important enough for you ladies to share with us this information today. I want to thank our back-end crew, Antoinette Miner, Lon Walls. I want to thank our sponsors for today, AARP and Comcast. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.